This cookout is over. HOA Ordinance 14-B. Commercial assembly. You have 5 minutes to clear these people out or I'm calling the city.
That permit is a city-issued document. Destroying it is a misdemeanor.
She laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that means who do you think you are? What she didn't know was that the man standing 10 feet behind her, quietly refilling his coffee, had spent the last 9 days going through 2 years of her bank records. And what she really didn't know was why he'd been doing it. She tore the wrong permit in front of the wrong people on the wrong evening. She just didn't know that yet. What's more dangerous, real power, or the absolute confidence of someone who has no idea whose driveway they're standing on? My name is Jake Mercer. I restore vintage motorcycles in a garage outside Austin, Texas. Not as a business, not exactly. I have a business license because the city requires one if money changes hands, and sometimes it does. A neighbor pays me $200 to rebuild a carburetor. A guy drives down from Dallas with a '68 Triumph Bonneville that hasn't run in 11 years and leaves $300 on my workbench before I can argue. I don't advertise. I don't have a website. Word gets around the way it does in small communities, quietly, and usually accurately. The garage is the kind of space that takes years to build right. Pegboard walls with every tool in its exact place. A hydraulic lift I bought secondhand from a shop in San Marcos. Fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency I stopped noticing a long time ago. Against the back wall, a 1972 Harley Ironhead in various states of reassembly, my current project, my ongoing conversation with a machine that someone else gave up on. I'm 51 years old. I retired early from the U.S. Marshals Service after a knee injury that ended my fieldwork but not my career entirely. I consulted for 2 more years before I decided I was done with all of it. Done with the travel, the paperwork, the particular weight that comes with carrying authority in rooms where things go wrong. I wanted quiet. I wanted grease on my hands and coffee in the morning and neighbors who waved from across the street. I got most of that. Every few months I open the garage on a Saturday, drag out the folding tables, and host a cookout for whoever wants to come. It started 3 years ago with 6 people. It grew on its own. By last summer we were averaging 35 to 40 neighbors, cold beer appearing from nowhere, somebody's kid running through the sprinkler at the edge of the yard, stories being told in lawn chairs until the fireflies came out. No tickets. No cover charge. No amplified music past 9. I had permits for everything that required a permit, because I'd spent 12 years watching what happens when people assume the rules don't apply to them. The Tuesday morning riding group started separately. 6 guys, a loose schedule, a route through the hill country that changed depending on who showed up and how much coffee we'd had. We didn't talk about what any of us did for work. That was an unspoken rule, one of the better ones I've encountered. Carl joined the group 4 years ago through a veterans motorcycle club we both belonged to peripherally. Beat-up Ford F-150. Worn jeans. A thermos he never offered to share. Quiet in the specific way that people are quiet when they've spent years in rooms where saying the wrong thing has consequences. He never mentioned being the district attorney for Travis County. I never asked. Some things you recognize without needing the title attached. There's a version of this story where I walked outside that first morning Sandra posted a violation notice on my door, looked her in the eye, and told her exactly who I was and exactly what I knew about how HOA authority actually works under Texas property code. I didn't do that. Not because I was afraid of her. Not because I wasn't certain of my ground. I didn't do it because I'd spent 12 years watching what happens when people reach for their credentials the moment they feel challenged. It becomes a different kind of problem, the kind where the other person stops hearing anything except the sound of their own humiliation. They dig in. They retaliate through whatever channels they still control. They get creative in ways that cost everyone time and money and goodwill that didn't need to be spent. I learned early in my career that authority used correctly is almost invisible. You don't wave it. You don't announce it. You position yourself, You document what needs to be documented, you follow the process exactly, and you let the process do what it was designed to do. The people who understood this were the ones I respected most in 22 years of federal service. The ones who didn't, who needed everyone in the room to know they had the badge before they'd even assessed the situation, those were the ones who created the most unnecessary damage. So when the first violation notice arrived, unauthorized commercial activity, HOA Form 7C, filed by Sandra Hollis, HOA President, I read it carefully, identified the 3 specific claims she'd made, pulled the relevant documentation for each one, and filed a written response through the proper channel within 48 hours. Business license. Noise permit. Written confirmation from the fire marshal's office that my property met all applicable standards. I did not call her. I did not go to her door. I did not mention that I had spent a career in federal law enforcement and had a reasonably precise understanding of what constitutes overreach versus legitimate HOA authority. I just filed the paperwork. There's a principle I've carried since my second year as a marshal, handed down by a senior deputy named Roland Voss who'd been doing the job for 30 years and still spoke like he had all the time in the world. Let the record do the talking. You stay clean, you stay documented, you stay patient, and you let the other person show you exactly who they are. Roland retired to a fishing cabin outside Kerrville. I think about that advice more now than I did when he said it. The second violation notice arrived 11 days after I filed my response to the first. Sandra had escalated to the HOA board without waiting for their review process to complete. She'd also CC'd the city. I read it. Made a copy. Filed it with my documentation folder. And I thought, she's going to keep going. The question wasn't whether I could stop her. The question was whether I should stop her now, or whether the most useful thing I could do was let her show everyone, fully and completely, exactly what kind of person had been elected to run this neighborhood. Have you ever chosen to stay quiet, not because you had no power, but because you understood that patience was the sharper weapon? The garage isn't just a garage. I need to say that plainly, because everything that comes after only makes sense if you understand what Sandra was actually threatening when she started filing paperwork with the city. My father built that structure in 1987 with his own hands and a borrowed circular saw. He poured the concrete slab himself over 2 weekends in August heat, which tells you something about his stubbornness and his standards in equal measure. He ran the electrical himself, permitted, inspected, signed off, because he believed that doing something right meant doing it so that anyone could check your work and find nothing to correct. He died in 2009, and the property passed to me with one instruction delivered the previous summer when we both knew his time was getting short: don't let it go to someone who won't use it. I've used it. The iron head against the back wall belonged to him. He rode it until his hands got bad, then parked it, then spent 12 years telling me he was going to get back to it. He never did. Finishing that restoration is the thing I think about when the work gets tedious. Every hour I put into it is a conversation I'm still having with him in the only language that feels adequate. What Sandra had set in motion, by the time the third violation notice arrived, was a formal city review of my property's zoning compliance. If the city determined that my occasional cookouts constituted commercial assembly under Austin Municipal Code, I faced 2 outcomes: either cease all gatherings permanently, or apply for a conditional use permit, a process that takes 4 to 6 months, costs several $1,000s in fees and legal review, and requires neighbor signatures that Sandra, as HOA president, had already begun quietly lobbying against. The 4th of July cookout was in 11 days. It was the cookout that mattered most to this neighborhood, the one where people brought their kids, where the older couple 3 doors down always came out for the first time all summer, where the folding tables filled up by 7 and nobody left before the fireworks. I had hosted it for 3 consecutive years. Missing it, being forced to cancel it by a process Sandra had deliberately accelerated, would mean something beyond the inconvenience. It would mean she had won by running out the clock. And she knew it. The timing wasn't accidental. Sandra Hollis had been HOA president for 18 months. She understood exactly what she was doing. What she didn't understand was what she had already set in motion 9 days earlier, in a government building across town, by someone who had nothing to do with cookouts or motorcycles or violation notices. That part was already out of her hands. Sandra had a system. I recognized it because I'd spent years watching people who operated through systems, who understood that raw confrontation is inefficient, that paperwork accumulates weight, that if you file enough notices through enough channels, eventually the target runs out of energy or money or patience and simply stops resisting. It's a particular kind of aggression. Slow, procedural, deniable. The kind where the person doing it can always say I was just following the rules while using those rules as a precision instrument aimed at a specific person. She had filed 17 complaints with the city in 4 months. I know this because I submitted a public records request for all HOA-initiated correspondence referencing my property address. The city clerk's office sent me a folder 43 pages thick. Most neighbors, I suspect, would have found that folder overwhelming. I found it useful. Each complaint had a date, a citation number, a stated basis, and a responding department. I cross-referenced every one against my existing documentation. 12 of the 17 had already been reviewed and closed, insufficient basis for action. 3 were pending standard review. 2 were new, filed the previous week, and contained language I hadn't seen in the earlier notices. One of them described Carl's truck. Not by name, she didn't have his name, which I'll explain in a moment, but by vehicle, a dark blue Ford F-150, partial plate, described as frequently present during suspected commercial activity hours and potentially indicative of illegal business transactions on residential property. I read that sentence twice. Then I set the folder down, picked up my coffee, and looked out the kitchen window at my driveway for a long moment. Sandra had been photographing Carl's truck 17 times, according to a separate log she'd attached as supporting documentation. She'd noted his arrival times, his approximate departure times, and had drawn a written conclusion that his repeated presence suggested I was running some kind of operation that required a regular business associate. Carl drives a beat-up F-150 because he genuinely doesn't care what he drives. He wears worn jeans and faded shirts because he genuinely doesn't care what he wears. In 18 years of prosecuting organized crime and 4 years of writing with our Tuesday group, I had never once heard him mention his title in casual company. He introduced himself as Carl. That was it. The idea that Sandra had spent months photographing and logging the truck of the district attorney for Travis County, and had then filed an official complaint with the city suggesting his visits were evidence of criminal enterprise, was the kind of irony that required a moment of quiet appreciation before anything else. I called Carl that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was characteristic. When I finished, there was a pause. She sent that to the city, he said. Not a question. With photographs and a log, I said. 17 entries. Another pause. Shorter. Jake, he said, I need you to save that document exactly as you received it. His voice had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Not angry. Something more deliberate than angry. I recognized the register. It was the same tone I'd heard from good prosecutors in the moment they realized a case had just become significantly larger than it appeared. I saved the document. I didn't ask why. Some things you recognize without needing the explanation attached. 3 days after I sent Carl that document, he called me back at 7 in the morning. I was in the garage, first cup of coffee, the Ironhead's primary chain spread across a clean shop rag on the workbench. Carl's calls came at normal hours. 7 in the morning was not a normal hour. I need to tell you something, he said. And I need you to let me finish before you respond. I set down the coffee. What Carl told me, in the careful and precise language of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades constructing cases that had to hold up under the most adversarial scrutiny imaginable, was this: his office had received a walk-in 9 days earlier. The visitor was a woman named Patricia Odom. Patricia was the assistant treasurer of our HOA. She had brought with her 2 years of bank statements, a folder of contractor invoices, and a handwritten timeline she'd spent 3 months assembling at her kitchen table after hours. Patricia had tried twice before to raise concerns through internal HOA channels. The first time, she was told the discrepancies she'd identified were clerical errors that had already been corrected. The second time, she was removed from her role reviewing invoices and reassigned to a purely administrative function: minutes, scheduling, correspondence. She had no formal authority remaining. She had only the records she'd quietly kept copies of. She walked into the Travis County District Attorney's office on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak to someone about financial misconduct. The someone she ended up speaking to was Carl. He told me the amount. $38,000. Contractor kickback structure to avoid the HOA board's approval threshold. Maintenance invoices inflated by 30 to 60%, the overages directed to a vendor entity that turned out to share a registered address with Sandra Hollis's personal LLC. A consulting fee, paid quarterly, to that same LLC, for services that had no corresponding documentation, no scope of work, no board authorization. Classic, Carl said. Sloppy, he added. Thoroughly documented, he finished. How long have you known this? I asked. 9 days, he said. We've been verifying. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its full repertoire in the oak tree at the edge of my property. I'd noticed it 3 mornings in a row. Carl, I said. I want to be clear about something. Whatever happens with Sandra and the HOA, that's separate from what she's been doing to me. I don't want the investigation used as leverage in my situation. That's not how this should work. There was a brief silence. Jake, Carl said, with the patience of a man who had prosecuted 30 felonies a year for 18 years, I know that. That's why I'm telling you now, before anything becomes public. So you understand the full picture. Not so you can use it. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That was the line I needed to hear. The line that confirmed the difference between someone who uses power correctly and someone who doesn't. I trusted it because I recognized it. It was the same line I'd drawn for myself, every time, for 12 years. Is there a harder thing than having the power to end something immediately, and choosing to let the process work instead? The 4th of July was 6 days out. I sat with that timeline for a long evening, the ironhead half assembled in front of me, a beer going warm on the workbench beside my documentation folder. 6 days. The city review was still pending. Sandra had filed a formal request with the HOA board to issue a cease and desist letter before the holiday weekend. I knew this because Margaret Chu, the board secretary, had quietly slipped a copy of the meeting agenda under my door with no note attached. Just the agenda. Margaret had lived 3 houses down for 11 years and had a way of communicating entire positions without saying a word. I thought about what it would cost to end this now. 1 phone call. Not even a long one. I knew people at the city, not in a corrupt way, in the way that someone who spent 12 years coordinating federal operations across municipal jurisdictions accumulates professional relationships with people who answer their phones. I could have the review expedited, the complaints contextualized, the cease and desist request dead before it reached a vote. Or I could say Carl's name in the right room. Watch the temperature drop immediately. I didn't make the call. I didn't say the name. Not because I wasn't certain it would work. Because doing it that way would mean Sandra never fully understood what she'd done, or to whom, or why it mattered. She'd experience a setback, paperwork blocked, requests denied, and she'd attribute it to bad luck or bureaucratic timing, and she'd find another target eventually. Someone without my particular set of relationships. Someone who didn't have a Carl. And I thought about Patricia Odom. Sitting at her kitchen table for 3 months, assembling a handwritten timeline after everyone with authority had told her twice that her concerns weren't real. $38,000. And not one person in that HOA structure had protected her ability to do the right thing. If I ended this quietly now, Patricia's courage stayed invisible. That felt like the wrong answer. When you can protect yourself easily but someone else's truth depends on you staying quiet a little longer, what do you owe them? The next morning I drove to the county clerk's office and requested certified copies of every HOA-initiated document filed against my property over the preceding 18 months. Not photocopies. Certified copies. Stamped, dated, legally authenticated. The kind that carry weight in proceedings where someone later tries to claim a document was misrepresented or taken out of context. The clerk, a methodical woman named Denise who processed my request without looking up from her keyboard, asked if I wanted them organized chronologically or by filing type. Both, I said. Chronological for my records, by filing type for the second set. She looked up then. Just briefly. Second set, she repeated. Please, I said. I paid the fee, waited 40 minutes in a plastic chair reading the municipal code provisions I'd already memorized, and left with 2 manila envelopes and a receipt that I photographed before putting it in my wallet. That afternoon I drafted a formal written response to the HOA board's pending cease and desist motion. Not emotional. Not combative. 4 paragraphs, each one addressing a specific claim in Sandra's original filing, each one citing the exact document number of the permit, license, or city correspondence that invalidated that claim. I attached 12 exhibits. I requested, in the final paragraph, that the board postpone any vote on the motion until they had reviewed the attached documentation in full, and I cited the specific section of the HOA's own bylaws that entitled any affected resident to a 14-day response window before punitive action could be taken. Sandra had not given me 14 days. She had given me 4. I sent the response by certified mail to every board member individually. 7 letters, 7 tracking numbers, all logged in my documentation folder with the send timestamps. Then I called a retired attorney named Frank Delacourt, who had done property law in Travis County for 30 years before his knees gave out and he decided fishing was a more honest profession. Frank wasn't representing me. I wasn't asking him to. I was asking him to read my response letter and tell me if I'd missed anything. He called back in 2 hours. Jake, he said, where did you learn to write a legal response? I've read a lot of them, I said. A pause. This is airtight. I thanked him, hung up, and went back to the Ironhead. The primary chain wasn't going to reassemble itself. Sandra received my certified letter on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon she had filed 2 new complaints. The first was a noise violation, 2 motorcycles idling in my driveway on a Tuesday morning for approximately 11 minutes, which she had timed and documented with a photograph taken from her front window. The second was a new commercial activity claim, this one alleging that the frequency and pattern of visitors to my property over the preceding 60 days constituted evidence of an unlicensed service business operating in a residential zone. She had attached a visitor log. Handwritten. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, estimated durations. 61 entries over 2 months. She had been sitting at her window with a notepad and a camera for 60 days. I read through the log carefully. Carl's truck appeared 17 times, as I already knew. Frank Delacourt's sedan appeared 4 times, he'd stopped by twice to look at the Bonneville project and twice for the riding group's pre-route coffee. There was an entry for my neighbor's teenage son, who'd helped me sand a fender one Saturday afternoon in exchange for $20 and a sandwich, which Sandra had logged as unidentified juvenile, possible labor violation. I set the log down. There was something clarifying about the level of effort she had invested. 61 entries. 2 months. This was not a neighbor with a grievance. This was a campaign, methodical and sustained, aimed at producing enough paperwork to overwhelm my ability to respond to all of it simultaneously. It was a tactic I recognized. I had seen it used by people with far more resources and far higher stakes than a neighborhood HOA dispute. The difference was that those people, in my experience, had eventually discovered that documented aggression leaves a very complete record of itself. Every entry in Sandra's log was a timestamp. Every complaint she filed was a data point. Every certified letter I hadn't yet opened was a piece of a pattern that, assembled correctly, told a story she had not intended to tell. I added both new filings to my documentation folder. Then I called Margaret Chu and asked when the board meeting was scheduled. "Tuesday," she said. Her voice was careful. "She's already called a special session." 4 days. The special board meeting was held in the community room of the neighborhood's shared amenity building, a beige rectangular space with folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, and an air conditioning unit that worked in the specific way that things work when nobody has maintained them properly for several years. 11 neighbors showed up uninvited. Word had gotten around. Sandra ran the meeting from a small folding table at the front, a stack of printed documents beside her, a portable speaker playing nothing because she'd brought it and then apparently decided against using it. She had dressed for the occasion, blazer, reading glasses on a lanyard, a legal pad with color-coded tabs. She looked like someone who had been preparing for this specific Tuesday evening for considerably longer than 4 days. I sat in the third row. I had my documentation folder. I had my certified copies. I had said nothing to anyone in the room before the meeting started. Sandra opened by reading aloud from her complaint summary. She used the word pattern 11 times in 6 minutes. She used the phrase commercial exploitation of residential space 4 times. She described my cookouts as a recurring revenue-generating enterprise that was fundamentally incompatible with the character and safety standards of this community. Then she looked directly at me. "Mr. Mercer has been given multiple opportunities to bring his activities into compliance," she said, her voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who believes the room is entirely with them. "He has responded with paperwork designed to delay and obstruct rather than to genuinely address the concerns of his neighbors." She paused. "The board has the authority and the obligation to act when a resident refuses to respect the standards that protect everyone in this community." She let that land. Then she said the thing she should not have said. "Some people," Sandra continued, setting down her legal pad and addressing the room rather than me specifically, "move into a neighborhood and assume the rules exist for other people. They assume that because nobody has stopped them yet, nobody will. They mistake patience for permission." A brief, composed smile. "That assumption ends tonight." She had no idea, none at all, how precisely those words described her own situation. I wrote them down verbatim in the margin of my folder. I had a feeling I would want the exact wording later. Have you ever watched someone build the case against themselves, one confident sentence at a time, while believing they were winning? Sandra called for a vote at 7:43 p.m. The motion was to issue a formal cease and desist order prohibiting any gatherings of more than 8 people on my property pending a full zoning compliance review, a process she estimated, with practiced casualness, would take approximately 3 to 5 months to complete. The 4th of July cookout was in 3 days. I raised my hand. Sandra looked at me the way people look at someone they've already decided is irrelevant. "Mr. Mercer, this is a board vote. Residents may address the board during the comment period, which has closed. Your bylaws require a 14-day response window before punitive action," I said. I submitted a written response citing that provision 4 days ago by certified mail. Every board member in this room received it. I paused. "I have the delivery confirmations." A brief silence. 2 board members exchanged a glance. Sandra's jaw tightened. "The board has reviewed your response and determined that the urgency of the situation warrants expedited action under Section 9, Paragraph 4 of the HOA Charter. Section 9, Paragraph 4 applies to emergency health and safety situations," I said. "A cookout with permits on file does not meet that threshold. I'd like that legal determination documented in the minutes." Margaret Chu, sitting at the end of the board table with her minutes laptop open, typed something without looking up. Sandra noticed. She didn't like it. "This meeting is not a courtroom, Mr. Mercer." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." She called the vote anyway. 3-2 in favor of the cease and desist. The two dissenting votes were Margaret and a retired schoolteacher named Howard Briggs who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone present. Howard looked at me after the vote with an expression that sat somewhere between apology and warning. What happened next took Sandra by surprise, though it shouldn't have. By 9 o'clock that evening, 3 things had occurred simultaneously. First, Frank Delacourt, who had not attended the meeting but had been monitoring my texts, sent a formal letter by email to every board member citing 4 specific violations of the HOA's own procedural charter in the conduct of the special session, and requesting a stay of the cease and desist order pending legal review. He sent it pro bono because, as he told me later, he found procedural abuse genuinely offensive in a way that had never diminished over 30 years of practice. Second, Margaret Chu submitted a formal minority report to the board record, documenting her objection to the expedited vote and citing the same bylaw provision I had raised. A minority report carries no stopping power. It does, however, become a permanent part of the official record. Third, a city compliance officer named Davis, who had been assigned to review Sandra's original commercial activity complaint against my property, sent me an email at 8:54 p.m. informing me that after review of submitted documentation, complaints 7C through 7F had been closed, insufficient basis for action. He noted that one complaint, the one describing a vehicle as potentially indicative of illegal transactions, had been flagged internally for a secondary review by a different department. A different department. I read that line twice. Then I forwarded the email to Carl with no message attached. He replied in 4 minutes. 2 words. I know. Margaret Chu came to my door the following morning at 8:15. She brought coffee, 2 cups, from the place on Lamar that she drove to specifically, which told me this wasn't a casual visit. I opened the garage door and she stood at the threshold the way people stand when they haven't decided yet how much they're going to say. I've been the board secretary for 4 years, she said, without preamble. I've watched 3 HOA presidents come and go. The previous 2 were imperfect people who made reasonable decisions in good faith most of the time. She handed me one of the coffees. Sandra is different. I waited. The contractor invoices, Margaret said. I noticed something wrong 14 months ago. Line items that didn't match the work orders. A vendor I'd never heard of appearing on 3 consecutive billing cycles for maintenance that I couldn't find any record of being performed. She looked at her coffee. I raised it once, internally, with the treasurer. He told me I was misreading the accounting structure. That it was more complex than it appeared. The treasurer at the time, I said carefully, or Patricia Odom. Margaret looked up. Something shifted in her expression, a recalibration, quick and quiet. She was reassessing what I knew. Patricia took over 8 months ago, she said. After the previous treasurer resigned. A pause. He resigned very suddenly. I nodded once and said nothing. Margaret studied me for a moment with the specific attention of someone who has been paying close attention to people for a long time and has learned to read the gap between what they say and what they know. Jake, she said, who are you, exactly? It was the most direct version of the question anyone had asked me since this started. I considered it honestly. I'm someone who restored motorcycles and hosted cookouts and filed his paperwork correctly, I said. That part is genuinely true. She accepted that. Not because it fully answered the question, but because she understood it was all I was going to give her right now, and she respected the boundary without needing it explained. The cookout, she said, standing to leave. Thursday. 4th of July. Planning on it, I said. She nodded. Turned to go. Stopped once at the end of the driveway and looked back. That cease and desist has no legal standing, she said. Frank Delacourt's letter was very clear. I know, I said. She smiled, brief, precise, satisfied, and walked back across the street. How many people in any given situation know the truth but are waiting for someone else to be the first one brave enough to say it out loud? The cease and desist letter arrived at my door Wednesday morning. Printed on HOA letterhead, signed by Sandra and a signature that took up more space than necessary, delivered by her personally at 7:45 a.m. while I was still holding my first coffee. She didn't knock. She slid it under the door. I read it at the kitchen table. Frank Delacourt had been right, it had no enforceable legal standing without a court order, and obtaining a court order in less than 24 hours for a neighborhood cookout dispute would require a judge willing to prioritize it above everything else on a holiday week docket. That was not going to happen. But the letter contained something Frank's analysis hadn't anticipated, because Sandra had escalated overnight in a direction none of us had tracked. She had contacted the city's Code Enforcement Division directly and requested an emergency property inspection for Thursday afternoon, the same afternoon as the cookout. Not a standard inspection request routed through the normal 30-day scheduling process. An emergency request, filed under a provision intended for situations involving immediate public safety risk, citing my property as a potential fire hazard based on the presence of motorcycle fuel and restoration equipment in proximity to an outdoor gathering. The fire marshal's office had provisionally scheduled an inspection for 4 p.m. The cookout started at 5. I sat with that for a moment. It was precise. Sandra understood that even if I passed the inspection cleanly, the presence of an official city vehicle in my driveway at 4 p.m., visible to arriving neighbors, would cast a shadow over the entire evening. People would ask questions. Some would leave. The ones who stayed would spend the first hour talking about the inspection instead of enjoying themselves. She didn't need to shut the cookout down. She just needed to poison it. I called Frank. She found a workaround, I said, and read him the relevant section. A long pause. That provision requires documented evidence of an imminent safety hazard, he said. Restoration equipment and fuel in a properly ventilated garage does not qualify. She filed it anyway. Yes. Another pause. Jake, I have to be honest with you. Blocking an emergency inspection request in less than 36 hours is a different problem than blocking a cease and desist letter. The city has discretion on whether to proceed regardless of the merits of the request. And in a holiday week, getting the right person on the phone to make that call. I know, I said. I hung up and stood at my kitchen window for a long time. The iron head was visible through the open garage door, primary chain finally reassembled, sitting on the lift under the fluorescent light. My father had poured that slab. Had run that electrical. Had built the thing right so anyone could check the work and find nothing to correct. I thought about Patricia Odom at her kitchen table. 3 months. Handwritten timeline. Then I picked up my phone and called Carl. Not to ask for help. To tell him what had happened and let him decide what, if anything, it meant for his timeline. He picked up on the second ring. I was about to call you, he said. What Carl told me took 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the microwave without meaning to, the way you track small fixed things when the information coming through the phone requires your full attention and you need something neutral to anchor yourself to. Patricia Odom's documentation had cleared the verification stage 2 days earlier. Carl's office had cross-referenced her bank statement copies against the HOA's filed financial disclosures with the county, disclosures that Sandra, as president, had signed and submitted under penalty of perjury. The numbers did not match. Not in ambiguous ways. In specific, recurring, documented ways that corresponded precisely to the vendor entity registered at Sandra's LLC address. $38,000. Confirmed. Carl's office had been moving carefully because they wanted the case complete before any action was taken, complete enough that there was no procedural gap Sandra could use to argue entrapment, selective prosecution, or evidentiary mishandling. They were close. They had been close for 4 days. How close, I said. Close enough that what she did this morning with the inspection request is now part of a larger picture, Carl said. Filing a fraudulent emergency safety claim to obstruct a private citizen's lawful activity, in the same week her financial records are under active review, that's not a separate incident. That's a pattern of conduct. And it's documented. I understood what he wasn't saying directly. The inspection request had not helped Sandra. It had handed his office another data point in a file that was already nearly airtight, evidence of a person who used official processes as personal weapons, consistently and without restraint, right up to and including the week she was under investigation. The inspection, I said. Thursday at 4. I'm aware of it, Carl said. The fire marshal's office received the request. They also received, as of this morning, a query from my office regarding the basis for emergency classification. A brief pause. These things take time to process. Government moves slowly sometimes. The way he said sometimes carried the full weight of a man who had spent 18 years deciding exactly how fast government moved on any given matter. Carl, I said. The cookout is at 5. I know, Jake. His voice was even. Settled. The voice of someone who has already thought 3 moves ahead and found the answer satisfactory. I'll be there at 5. Same as always. Another pause. Save me a spot near the grill. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, there was no announcement, no visible change in the Wednesday morning light coming through the window, no sound except the mockingbird still working through its repertoire in the oak tree. But the shape of the next 48 hours had just become clear in a way it hadn't been an hour ago. Sandra had spent 2 months building a case against me. Filing, documenting, escalating, photographing, logging, timing. She had been meticulous. She had been thorough. She had assembled, with considerable effort and across dozens of official filings, a comprehensive and detailed record of exactly who she was. Tomorrow evening, that record was going to matter in a way she had not anticipated. When someone hands you the rope they later hang themselves with, do they ever realize, in the moment, what they're doing? The city inspector arrived at 3:45 p.m. Not 4 o'clock. 3:45, which meant neighbors already pulling up lawn chairs at the edge of my driveway saw the white municipal vehicle before they saw the folding tables. The inspector's name was Garrett, a methodical man in his 50s with a clipboard and the particular expression of someone who has been sent on an errand he didn't originate and doesn't fully endorse. He introduced himself formally, showed me his credentials, and told me he'd received an emergency classification request citing fuel storage and open flame hazards in proximity to a planned public gathering. I handed him my documentation folder without a word. He worked through it carefully. Ventilation specs. Fire marshal sign-off from 2 years prior, renewed 6 months ago. Fuel storage compliance certificates. The fire marshal's personal confirmation on file that my setup met all applicable residential workshop standards. Garrett made notes. He photographed several things. He measured the distance from my fuel storage cabinet to the nearest exterior wall. Across the street, Sandra stood on her front porch watching. She had her phone out. Recording. At 4:22 p.m., Garrett closed his clipboard. Mr. Mercer, he said, I'm not finding a basis for the emergency classification. Your documentation is thorough and your setup is compliant. I'll be filing my report accordingly. He paused. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you for being thorough, I said. He drove away at 4:26. 34 minutes before the cookout started. What happened in those 34 minutes was the part that cost something. By the time Garrett left, 11 neighbors had arrived early and witnessed the inspection. The story that spread through the arriving crowd was accurate in its facts but carried a weight that facts alone don't fully convey. Jake had a city inspector at his house right before the cookout. Sandra filed a complaint. There was some kind of safety investigation. People who hadn't been there for the board meeting, who hadn't read Frank's letter or Margaret's minority report, arrived at my driveway carrying the vague and uncomfortable sense that something was wrong, that there was some unresolved official question hanging over the evening. 3 families who had confirmed attendance didn't come. Howard Briggs arrived, took one look at my face, and handed me a beer without saying anything. Margaret came at 5:15 and positioned herself near the entrance as if by accident, greeting people as they arrived, answering questions in the calm and factual way of someone who had all the relevant information and was willing to share it. She did more good in those first 40 minutes than I could have done myself. But the mood was different. Careful. Conversation that should have been easy had an edge of uncertainty running through it. People were watching the street. Watching Sandra's porch, where she had gone back inside but left her front light on. I stood at the grill and kept moving. Kept the food coming. Kept my face neutral and my voice level and reminded myself, in the specific way that 12 years of federal work trains you to remind yourself, that the next hour mattered more than this one. Carl arrived at 5:48. Beat-up Ford. Worn jeans. Faded veteran's t-shirt. He got a paper plate from the stack near the condiments, filled it without ceremony, and came to stand near the grill. "How are you doing?" he said quietly. "Waiting," I said. He nodded once. Ate a piece of cornbread. Looked at nothing in particular with the relaxed attention of a man who had waited out much longer and much darker things than a neighborhood cookout on a July evening. Across the street, Sandra's front door opened. What does it cost a person to hold their ground in the moment when everything looks like it's already lost? There's a photograph on the pegboard above my workbench. My father and I, 1989. He's 43, which is 8 years younger than I am now, a fact that keeps surprising me. I'm 11, standing beside the ironhead in this same garage, holding a wrench I almost certainly had no idea how to use correctly. He has his hand on my shoulder. We're both looking at the camera, but his weight is slightly toward me, the posture of a man who is always, without announcement, making sure you're steady. He was a deputy sheriff for 26 years in a county 3 hours south of here. He never talked about the job at home. Not the cases, not the politics, not the difficult days. What he talked about was process. About how the difference between justice and revenge was documentation. About how the people who abused authority always believed, right up until they didn't, that nobody was watching carefully enough. About how the most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of noise was stay quiet and keep their record straight. I thought about that photograph Thursday evening while the cookout moved uncertainly around me, while neighbors spoke in lower voices than they should have, while 3 families stayed home because Sandra Hollis had successfully made my driveway feel like contested ground. I thought about Patricia Odom at her kitchen table. 3 months of evenings after her day job, assembling a handwritten timeline that nobody in her official structure had been willing to receive. Doing the right thing anyway. Carrying the weight of it alone until she decided she was done carrying it alone and walked into a government building and asked to speak to someone. Patricia had trusted that the process would work if the right person was willing to listen. She had trusted that documentation mattered. That the truth, assembled carefully and presented correctly, would eventually be more powerful than the person trying to bury it. My father believed the same thing. I believed it too. Had believed it for 51 years, 12 of them in federal service, the rest in the accumulated evidence of a life where the people who stayed patient and kept their record straight had, in my experience, almost always outlasted the people who hadn't. Almost always. Sandra's front door opened at 6:02 p.m. I set down my spatula. Straightened up. Across the driveway, Carl glanced over. Set his paper plate on the table beside him. Didn't move yet. Just watched the street with the unhurried attention of a man who already knew how this ended. I took one breath. And waited. She crossed the street like she was serving a warrant. Phone up, recording. Blazer from the board meeting, same lanyard, same reading glasses. She walked through the gap in the lawn chairs with the focused momentum of someone who had rehearsed this entrance and intended to make it count. 40 neighbors went quiet in the specific way that crowds go quiet when they sense something has shifted from social to serious. Sandra stopped 6 feet from the grill. This gathering, she said, loudly enough for everyone present to hear, is in direct violation of the cease and desist order issued by this HOA on Tuesday evening. I have documented this violation and I am formally notifying Mr. Mercer that continued noncompliance will result in legal action filed through Travis County Civil Court no later than Monday morning. She turned slightly, sweeping the crowd. Anyone present is a witness to this notification. Nobody moved. I looked at her steadily. The cease and desist has no enforceable legal standing without a court order, Sandra. Frank Delacourt's letter to the board cited 4 specific procedural violations in Tuesday's session. That letter is part of the official record. I kept my voice level. Conversational. If you file in civil court, that record goes with it. Her jaw tightened. I'm not here to debate procedure with you. I know, I said. She turned then, and she saw Carl. He was standing 8 feet to my left, paper plate in hand, looking at her with the patient and entirely neutral expression of a man who has all the time in the world. The faded veteran's t-shirt. The worn jeans. The same quiet presence she had photographed 17 times from her front window and logged as evidence of criminal enterprise. Something flickered across her face. Not recognition, she still didn't know. Something closer to the instinct that precedes recognition, the animal sense that the geometry of a situation has changed in a way you haven't yet identified. She pointed her phone at him. You, she said. You're a regular here. You've been present at every one of these gatherings. You're part of this operation. Carl set his plate down on the table beside him. Carefully. The way you set something down when you want both hands free and you want the gesture to be visible. Sandra, he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft, quiet. There is a difference. Soft yields. Quiet holds. My name is Carl Whitfield. I'm the district attorney for Travis County. The crowd didn't gasp. It did something quieter and more complete than a gasp, it stilled. The particular stillness of 40 people simultaneously revising everything they thought they understood about the last 3 minutes. Sandra's phone dropped an inch. Her mouth opened. Carl reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the jacket he'd draped over the back of a lawn chair when he arrived, the one nobody had looked at twice, and produced a credentials wallet. He opened it and held it at a distance she could read without approaching. Travis County District Attorney's Office. Carl B. Whitfield. Photograph. Seal. I've been attending Jake's cookouts for 2 years, Carl continued, in the same even register. I've been riding motorcycles with him on Tuesday mornings for 4. During that time, I have observed no commercial activity, no safety violations, and no conduct of any kind that would warrant the 17 complaints you filed with the city regarding this property. He paused. I have, however, spent the last 11 days reviewing financial records submitted to my office by a member of this HOA. The color left Sandra's face. Not gradually. At once. Those records, Carl said, document a pattern of financial misconduct involving HOA funds over a period of approximately 26 months. Contractor kickbacks. Inflated maintenance invoices. Payments directed to a vendor entity registered at a residential address that your office will recognize. He looked at her without hostility and without theater. Just clarity. The investigation is complete. The documentation has been verified. Sandra's phone was fully lowered now. Her hand was at her side. You should know, Carl said, that the complaint you filed with the city last week, the one describing my vehicle as potentially indicative of illegal business transactions, became part of our evidentiary record 2 days ago. Filing a false official complaint against a public officer in the conduct of his duties carries its own set of consequences under Texas law. I want to make sure you understand that clearly, and that you understand it in front of witnesses. He stopped. Let it sit. Margaret Chu was standing perfectly still near the entrance. Howard Briggs had set down his beer. 11 people who had arrived skeptical and uncertain were now wearing the expression of people watching a structure they hadn't known was unstable finish falling. Sandra looked at me. I don't know what she was looking for. Satisfaction, maybe. Some sign that this was personal, that I had engineered this moment as revenge for the violation notices and the inspection and the cease and desist. Something she could use to reframe what was happening as a targeted attack rather than the natural consequence of her own conduct. I gave her nothing. Not because I was being cruel. Because there was nothing to give. This wasn't my moment. It was Patricia Odom's. It was Margaret Chu's. It was Roland Voss's 30-year-old advice, proven right again in a driveway in Austin on a July evening with fireflies starting to appear at the edges of the yard. Let the record do the talking. Stay clean, stay documented, stay patient. Some people, I said quietly, just to her, not to the crowd, assume that because nobody has stopped them yet, nobody will. I held her eyes. They mistake patience for permission. Her own words. Verbatim. From the board meeting 4 days ago. She knew it immediately. The recognition moved through her face like weather. She left without speaking. Walked back across the street, through her front door, and turned off the porch light she'd left burning all evening. Carl picked up his paper plate. Good cornbread, he said. Sandra Hollis was arrested 3 weeks later. Not at a cookout. Not at a board meeting. On a Tuesday morning, at her front door, by 2 Travis County deputies who knocked at 7:15 a.m. and waited calmly on her porch until she answered. The handcuffs, as Carl described it to me afterward with characteristic understatement, did not care about HOA ordinances. She was charged with misappropriation of HOA funds, filing false official documents, and 1 count related to the fraudulent emergency inspection request. The third charge was the one she hadn't anticipated, the one that came directly from the complaint she'd filed about Carl's truck. That complaint, logged and time-stamped and submitted under her signature to a city office, had become the cleanest piece of evidence in a file full of clean evidence. Her own words. Her own filing. Her own certainty that the quiet man in the beat-up Ford was nobody worth worrying about. The HOA hired a forensic accountant the following month. The full audit confirmed $38,400 in misappropriated funds, traced across 22 months of transactions. The vendor LLC was dissolved. The previous treasurer, the one who had resigned so suddenly 8 months earlier, cooperated with investigators and provided additional documentation that filled the remaining gaps in the timeline. Patricia Odom was appointed interim treasurer by unanimous board vote. Margaret nominated her. Howard Briggs seconded it. The vote took 40 seconds. The recovered funds were returned to the HOA reserve account. At the following annual meeting, the board voted to reduce annual dues by 30%. The reduction was permanent, written into the charter revision that passed with no dissenting votes. I hosted a cookout the following Saturday to celebrate nothing specific and everything general. 46 people came, which was the largest we'd had. The older couple 3 doors down brought potato salad in a bowl I recognized from every summer I could remember in this neighborhood. Howard Briggs told a story about the time he'd coached a little league team that went winless for an entire season and what he'd learned from it that still applied. Margaret sat in a lawn chair near the garage door and stayed until the fireflies came out, which was later than she usually stayed. Carl arrived in the beat-up Ford at 5:30. Worn jeans. No particular announcement. He filled a plate, found a lawn chair, and drank my coffee the way he always drank my coffee, quietly, without offering to share, with the settled contentment of a man who has found the specific version of a Tuesday evening that suits him exactly. He still doesn't announce himself to anyone. Nobody asks. The ironhead is running now. I took it out for the first time 2 weeks after the arrest, early morning, before the heat built up, through the hill country roads we used to ride on Tuesdays. The engine ran clean. The chain held. My father's machine, moving again under its own power, carrying the weight of everything he built right. Some things, if you do them correctly from the beginning, last longer than the people who tried to stop them. The quietest person in any room is usually carrying the most, What would change if we remembered that before we decided who deserved our respect?
But here's what this story was really about. It was never really about cookouts. It was never about noise permits or HOA ordinances or whether a man had the right to grill in his own driveway on the 4th of July. It was about something older than any of that. It was about what happens when someone decides, without evidence, without inquiry, without a single honest question, that they already know exactly who you are. And that who you are means you don't deserve the same consideration they'd extend to someone they respected. Sandra didn't harass Jake because she had a legitimate concern about neighborhood standards. She harassed him because she looked across the street and saw someone she had already categorized, a retired guy in a garage, tools and motorcycles and folding tables. Nobody important. Nobody who would know how to fight back. Nobody she needed to take seriously. That assumption was the beginning of her undoing. Everything else followed from it. Here's why she lost. Not because Jake was more powerful. Not because Carl happened to be the district attorney, though that didn't hurt. She lost because she put everything in writing. Every complaint, every log, every timestamp, every overreach, every procedural violation, every fraudulent classification request, every photograph of a man she decided was suspicious without once thinking to ask his name. She built the case against herself, methodically, over 2 months, and handed it to the exact person best positioned to use it. Arrogance does that. It makes people sloppy. When you're certain you're untouchable, you stop checking your own work. And here's why Jake won. Not anger. Not leverage. Not because he made a single phone call to the right person at the right moment. He won because he never mistook patience for weakness, in himself or in the process. He documented everything. He followed every procedure exactly. He gave the system the chance to work before he asked anyone to intervene. And when the moment came, he didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to explain himself. He just needed to stand still long enough for the truth to become undeniable in front of witnesses. That kind of discipline is rarer than it sounds. Most of us, understandably, humanly, would have broken earlier, would have made the call, dropped the name, ended it fast. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's something worth understanding about what gets lost when you do. The full picture never becomes visible. The pattern never gets documented. The people who needed someone to hold the line, Patricia Odom at her kitchen table, Margaret Chu at that board meeting, every neighbor who'd been quietly watching, they never get their moment either. Patience, in the right hands, isn't passive. It's a strategy. Most of us have met some version of Sandra Hollis. Maybe not in an HOA. Maybe at work. Maybe in a building, a committee, a system you had no obvious way around. Someone who decided the rules were theirs to wield and yours to absorb. Someone who looked at you and saw nothing worth worrying about. I think about what that feels like. And I think about what it costs to hold your ground anyway. Here's the question I want to leave you with. At what point in this story would you have stopped documenting and just fought back? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you stay for stories about quiet preparation outlasting loud authority, there are more coming. I'll see you in the next one.